Thank you, sir, and thank you for the kind words. And this is the first time I'm at the Naval War College, and that is largely because of my friend Hayat Alvi, who said that since I'm all the way from India in DC for a week, I can jolly well come over and share my understanding of my subject. And what is rather peculiar is that, when somebody comes from India, you ask them to speak on India foreign policy and things like that, or probably Indo-US relationship. So I said, my turf is Middle East. That's what I know. And will there be an interest on the subject? And Hayat said, let's try. So here I am. And if you look at India, we normally talk about the South Asia as the most important region for India. And everything to do Indian policy is linked with what happens in South Asia. But if you take a step back, South Asia is a liability for India. If you make a very honest assessment, your immediate neighbor is often your immediate source of concern, which is true for any country in the world, but more so in the Indian context. What normally happens in South Asia is, if India does not pay sufficient attention to these countries' problems, their problem will become India's problem. And that's exactly most of the time, whether in terms of flooding, in terms of migration, in terms of violence, terror, all these issues. These problems which affect the neighboring countries will eventually come to India if India doesn't pay sufficient attention. But if you look at seriously, is there anything good about the region? Honestly not. It's only they are strategically important only in the negative sense of the word, not in the positive sense of the word. I know this is not a politically correct thing to say, but my region, the Middle East, is entirely different. It has its own problems, no doubt about it. But it also has enormous opportunity for India. I think that is what I'm trying to look at. In spite of all the difficulties, challenges and troubles one associates Middle East with, Middle East is perhaps the only region which can help India's economic and political growth. That is how I'm going to begin. Historically, India and the Middle Eastern countries have enormous relationship dating back to even the first temple period, that is in the 4th and 5th century before Christ. And that kind of association was there in terms of trade, commerce, cultural exchanges, all sorts of things. But if you look at in the 20th century, the relation with the region was largely affected by what was happening within the country. That is, the political tussle between the Congress Party and the Muslim League. That is how the Middle East became important. And if you look at it, that is the internal tussle between Congress and the Muslim League for the support of the Indian Muslim population dominated how India looked at the Middle East. We'll come to that when we talk about Israel a little later. But after 47, the Congress-Muslim League rivalry became Indo-Pakistan competition. And that is how it is. So India and Pakistan used to fight for political support from the Middle Eastern countries. This was there from 47 till I would say 1992. Two things happened at that point of time. The end of the Cold War brought about a change in Indian policy. You recognize the world is no longer bipolar. It is not that you support a particular country and accept everything that power says, but you have to make immediate and independent assessment. That is number one. So India was no longer following the Soviet policy on foreign policy issues. The second thing was India's economic development began. If you look at it in 1991, India was in a very bad situation. You must have seen Indian women. They normally enjoy jewelries. You can see all sorts of jewelries. It's part of their culture. But what is the real reason for that? It is not that the women enjoy jewelry. When men find it difficult, they simply go to their wife, give me your jewelry, I need money. So the jewelry actually became a process of mortgaging so that you can continue your economic asset. As a country, India did exactly that. In 1991, India did not have foreign exchange resources to buy immediate food requirements for 2 weeks. That's all you had money. Third week, you don't have money to buy grains. Under those circumstances, Indian government mortgaged gold in London Stock Exchange. That is what an Indian man normally does. The government of India exactly did, mortgage the national wealth. That was the kind of economic situation we were there. Under those circumstances, we began to liberalize. We began to introduce economic reform. Last year, the same India gave 10 billion to IMF in terms of resources. India is the largest shareholder in a number of multilateral financial institutions, the BRIC banks, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It is a major stockholder in the China-initiated bank. So your financial situation has improved in the last 2 decades, which is also reflected in how India located Pakistan vis-a-vis the Middle East. India was also aspiring to be a great power. One can agree with the idea, one can disagree with that, but the aspiration was very much there. India wanted to be a great power, to be recognized as a permanent member of the Security Council. There is a catch. If you want to be a permanent member of the Security Council, you can't be fighting with Pakistan constantly. So you have to choose whether you are a South Asian power competing with Pakistan or an Asian power competing with China. So India will have to make the choice, which basically meant in the Middle Eastern context, India began to look at Middle East without any reference to Pakistan. And that you can see it very visibly in countries like Saudi Arabia. As long as Pakistan was a factor, it was always problematic. As one Saudi diplomat said, Pakistan is a friend, brother, India is a friend. You know, if you're familiar with Indian mythology, I would rather be a friend than a brother. Okay, the problem with a brother is almost extremely difficult. But in the real sense, as long as India brought Pakistan into the table, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and others could not have good relations with India. It is only after India de-linked the two, you can find the countries having greater relations with India since the early 90s. Now, what are the core issues which govern India's interests? I would basically say about 3: energy, trade, migration. These are the 3 dominant pillars which dominate India's interest with the Middle East. When Indian economy was very small, we were relatively self-sufficient in energy. Almost 2/3 of our energy requirements were locally produced. Only about 1/3 was imported from outside. The moment Indian economy started growing, your demand began to accelerate. The supply could not make up with the demand. With the result, from the early 90s, 2/3 was imported, only 1/3 was produced locally. That was for the first few years. But today, about 80% of India's hydrocarbon are imported. And if you go by any assessment, Indian or international, they say by 2020, 90% of India's oil and gas will have to be imported. Where is it going to come from? Most probably the Persian Gulf region, because that's the geographically closer and it is relatively less expensive to produce. So therefore, energy security is the most dominant driver for India's engagement with the Middle East. And the Gulf countries presently contribute about 2/3 of India's total oil imports. But the oil import is very funny game. You know, it is not only for India's domestic consumption. If you look at the statistics, in the last 6 years, India is also exporting oil products. And this year, 22% of India's exports came from oil-related industry. In other words, at one level, you need oil for your domestic needs, and you also need oil for the hydrocarbon industry within the country so that you can re-export. So if you put the import and export component, about 1/3 of India's total trade is energy related, which basically means once again Middle East comes into the picture. And because of this, the Middle East is India's largest trading partner. Once upon a time it was US, then it was European Union. Today the Persian Gulf region is India's largest trading partner. Somewhere around 25% of India's total trade is with this region. We are talking about $200 billion. That's the number we are talking about out of $800 billion. With the result, the countries of the region are emerging as the major trading partners of India. For some time, UAE was India's largest trading partner. This year it was overtaken by China, United States, and then followed by UAE. But still, our trade with UAE is $60 billion. China is somewhere around 71, US is somewhere around 61, and UAE is about $60 billion. It's the largest trading partner. If you look at the Gulf region, out of 20 largest trading partners of India, 6 come from the region: Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE. The only exceptions are 3 smaller countries: Bahrain, Oman, Yemen. Because they are smaller economies, therefore they are not India's largest trading partners. So when you look in terms of energy, the region is important. When you look in terms of trade, the region is important. Then comes the migration. From the oil crisis of 1973, you have Indians going to the region for employment, like any other third world countries. Today, we have something like 6 to 7.5 million Indians working in the Gulf. The estimates are not available. It's only a guesstimates we get, assessment, what was there. But rough understanding is about 7 million Indians are working in the countries. In Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, 500,000 Indians are working. In Kuwait, 700,000 Indians are working. In UAE, it is 2.6 million Indians are there. In Saudi Arabia, close to 3 million Indians are working. If you look at Dubai, Indians make up 40% of the resident population. In number of countries, whether it's Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, the natives are a minority. The expatriates make up about 80 to 85% of the population. In all the countries, the largest population group is Indian. Indians are employed in all sorts of categories, in a menial job to middle level job, as well as in the professional category. For a very long time, Indians are only involved in construction, drivers, as maid and others. But gradually now in banking, education, hospital, tourism, even some of them are actually employed in the government. So you have a different profile which is coming up in the region. With the result, not only these 7 million people are employed, which means 7 million families in India are gainfully employed. You know, in the era of unemployment, this is a pretty large number. It's not only 7 million here, but 7 million families back home. Even if you say about 4 persons, we are talking somewhere around 30 million employed persons in some form or the other. And the second thing is, they remit money. No matter how they live, whatever conditions, they save money and remit to their back home so that people back home can live a better life than they left. Last year, the World Bank says the remittances alone constituted somewhere around $71 billion. Out of them, about 50% came from the Gulf. And now you know why India is not making any statement on the popular protests in the region. We know that from 2010 December, the region is up in flames. I know It's always inflamed, that's a different story, but at least popular protest. The Arab Spring was there from December 2010. India never made any statement. The only statement was regarding Egypt. They said Mubarak should listen to the voice of the people. That's the maximum an Indian foreign minister was ready to say. But when did he say that? He said a day after 3,000 Indians were evacuated from Egypt. Not before that. And you won't even find similar statement in the Gulf. We all know Bahrain is in flames. Saudi Arabia is not very good. You will find all the other places. In some form or the other there is a tension. But India never made any statement against any of the countries. The reason is simple. Energy security. Because most of the oil companies are state controlled. It's not a private companies. So the moment you make one wrong statement, you will have a problem with energy. Worse, if anything you said against the regime will say Indians can go back. Two problems. 7 million, what do they do back home? They left India because they could not find a better employment. That is why they went to Gulf. And what they will do back home, number one. Number two, how we are going to evacuate 500,000 people in a matter of weeks? How do you do this? No ships, no aircrafts, nothing. The only possibility is you can build a bridge. That's the only thing. But that also takes time to build. So therefore, because of the ground realities, India never said anything about the Arab Spring or popular protest. And similarly, you will often find statements about the workers' rights being not taken care, abuse of workers, payment and other issues. You never find Government of India making a public statements. You will find in recent days in the social media, but not by Government of India. The reason is you make one wrong step, you're going to put millions of people in jeopardy. And that is how India began to maintain very silent position on this. Now, where does it leaves us about Israel? Because we are talking only about the Gulf. What does Israel do? If you look at it, India-Israel relation is very peculiar. Bilaterally, we never had a problem. But we are part of the third world alignment. With the result, we understood Israel differently. So from 1920s, when the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, the Indian nationalists identified themselves with the Arabs of Palestine. That was a time when Balfour Declaration was issued, when Britain was talking about supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine. So it was at the same time India identified with the Arabs of Palestine. The reason was simple. In 1920s, India had a domestic situation called Khilafat struggle. The Congress party was leading the Indian national struggle, but there was a feeling that it is not able to secure the support of the Indian Muslims. The Muslims are not part of the national struggle. It was in those circumstances you had a problem called Khilafat, which is basically talking about the Khilafat at that time was an Ottoman Empire. Khilafat basically meant leader of the Sunni Islam, cutting across territorial boundaries. At that time this was the office which was created in 632 after Prophet Muhammad died, and therefore they thought the community cannot be governed without a leader. So you need a leader to maintain the community. It was in that context the Caliph was established. And that office continued in various places. Eventually it came to Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. So amidst the First World War, when things were happening in Ottoman Empire, the Indian Muslims thought the British were attacking Ottoman Empire. It was not a conflict between a British Empire and the Ottoman Empire, but it is a Christian Britain which was trying to undermine the Muslim Ottomans. That is how the Indian Muslims read it. In those contexts, the Congress party supported the Muslims, thinking that, okay, it's a quid pro quo. I support the Muslims and the Caliph, the Muslims support the national struggle against the British. That is how the calculation was done. But if you look back, the Palestine problem came around the same time. So therefore, it becomes easier for the Indian nationalists to say, we support the Palestinian position, not the Jewish position regarding the national home. So from 1920, when the Jews were looking for a national home in Palestine, India identified itself with the Arabs of the problem. That continued for almost 70 years. When the Palestine question came before the United Nations in 1947, India said, we are against partition. We are supporting a federal state, not a partition of Palestine. The funny part is, India accepted partition in India, into India and Pakistan. And Pakistan was basically a state based on the question of religion as an identity. You have no problems with that. But when it comes to Palestine, no, we can't have a state based on religion. Okay? This is how India viewed it. We'll come to that in a while. And I think, with the result, you oppose partition, India opposed the admission of Israel into the United Nations. But then you recognize, Israel has come into being, it is a member of the United Nations, all the permanent members have recognized except China, and at that point of time, realism meant you also recognize Israel. So it was in those circumstances, in 1950, India recognized Israel but did not establish relations. They are still not sure, what do I do? Whether I go along and have a relationship, because you can't ignore Israel exists. At the same time, you don't want to override all your past policies. In those circumstances, you had 1956 Suez Crisis. Israel joining hands with Britain and France attacking Egypt. Indian problem was not Israel attacking Egypt. That was not the problem. The problem was Israel collaborating with the French and the British. Because French and the British were imperial powers, they were colonial powers, there was an anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle in the third world countries. Under those circumstances, Israel collaborated with the British. Therefore, Nehru comes to Parliament and says, time is not right for normalizing relations with India. By the way, you must have gone to India, right? Some of you? You have any idea what is the word for yesterday in Hindi? It's called kal. Kal means yesterday. Tomorrow is also called kal. So when I say kal, you don't know I'm talking about yesterday or tomorrow. Time doesn't exist. If something had to happen in India, it's here and now. It is now or never. So Nehru says time is not right. The interesting thing was, in 1952, a senior Israeli diplomat comes to Nehru. What's going on? You recognize in 1950, 2 years, no relations. Nehru says, come to my house for lunch. They have a lunch in his residence, Teen Murthy. And then Nehru says, we are in the middle of the parliamentary elections. Once the elections are over, I'll just bring it to the cabinet and relations will be established. You will have a resident mission in Tel Aviv. He said it in 1952. It happened, but took 40 years. It was only in January 1992 India normalized relations with Israel. Why did they do it? Two reasons. One, the end of the Cold War. So you no longer have the bipolar world having to follow everything with the Soviet Union did. And therefore you need to say that there is a different world. The second thing was the Kuwait War. In the Kuwait crisis, Saddam Hussein invaded, occupied, annexed Kuwait. When the entire Middle East was criticizing Saddam Hussein, there is one person who comes up and supports Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat. He says, Saddam Hussein made a proposition. If Israel withdraws from West Bank, I will withdraw from Kuwait. And for a very strange reason, Arafat accepted the linkage, which angered everyone. Because if you look at Arafat's background, he started Fatah in Kuwait when he was a student. And the Kuwaitis thought, this is not the way you repay the gratitude. When my country was occupied, you just bring up other issues. So at the end of the Kuwait crisis, what happened was the Palestinian question lost its regional relevance. While everyone was supporting the Palestinian cause, but it is no longer an issue in the regional politics. For India, Palestine question was the only way it could promote its interests. From 1947 till 1992, India was not a politically influential player. Whatever influence it had ended in 1962 at the Sino-Indian conflict. The world said, you take care of your territory before you talk about leadership of others. So India's political leadership ended in 62, and we had something called Aid India Consortium. What is that? You basically do begging in a 5-star hotel. That's what it was. India had dependent on external sources for a number of economic activities. So till India's economy grew after 91, India did not have a political leverage, it did not have an economic leverage, it did not have a diplomatic leverage. Therefore, the only way you could promote your interest in the Middle East was, I am supporting the Palestinians. So the Palestinian cause became a political instrument for India to promote its interest. But in 92, the Palestinian cause lost its relevance because Saddam Hussein was supported by Yasser Arafat. It was in those circumstances India decided, okay, it's a different world. So you no longer depend on the Soviet Union for your foreign policy interests. You no longer depend on Arafat and PLO to promote your Middle East interests. And your political rhetoric is not going to pay any gains. Under those circumstances, India normalized relations with Israel. And if you look at it, from 92 till today, the relations have improved tremendously in terms of economy, political exchanges, and military interactions. Actually, Indian president will be in Israel on Tuesday, 13th. 13, 14, 15, he will be making his first state visit to Israel. And the Prime Minister is likely to go to Israel early next year. There is an enormous military exchanges between the two countries. But what is happening in the last few months is not the military exchanges or technological cooperation, but it is in the less known areas of cooperation. Recycling, water management, agriculture, Ganges purification, that is cleaning the Indian river Ganges. These are the areas both the countries are collaborating at an extensive level. And that's where the money is. Because if you must be familiar with that, Israel doesn't export platform. It doesn't produce platform, it doesn't export platforms, ships, aircrafts and tanks. Therefore, Israel's ability to export too many things to India are limited. This will be dominated only by Britain, US, France, to a lesser extent South Africa and Russia. And other countries, Israel doesn't have a space there. So the real activity will be in the non-military areas of cooperation. That's what is going to be there. Finally, ISIS. You know, when the September 11 terror attack took place, a number of Indians said, you see, no Indian was there. Indian was not among the terrorists who brought down the Twin Towers, which basically means Indian Islam is inclusive, accommodative, it is not extremist. They were extremely happy. Today, you can't be. ISIS also has an Indian connection. The number is small. In India, we have the second largest Muslim population in the world, somewhere around 130 million. Probably half of American population, roughly. That's the size we are talking about. So when you talk about 1 dozen people out of 130 million, statistically is nothing. But the problem is, terrorism doesn't depend on the number of people. Only 15 guys brought down to interval. So it's not the number of people, but the lethal nature of their activities. That's what matters. So what you find is a number of Indians have been found to be associated with ISIS, or they were actually doing propaganda stuff through social media. This is a new trend which India has not faced. What is more interesting, some of these volunteers were actually Indians working in the Gulf countries. That makes it even worse. Because for a very long time there was an argument within India, some of the Indians who go to the region are becoming radicalized by the time they return to the country. They bring in more conservative worldview of Islam when they come back to India. So there is always an argument. But now you find people are actually using social media to entice people, this is a new trend. Which means India will have to engage with these countries more vigorously. So your energy cooperation, economic cooperation, immigration, these are all important. But new area of cooperation is counterterrorism. Until recently, when you say counterterrorism, you only talked about India's cooperation with Israel. That's the only area we talked about. But in the last couple of years, you will find other countries are cooperating with India in terms of fighting religious extremism. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and more importantly, UAE. I think a couple of months ago, Prime Minister went to UAE. It's a visit, state visit. He spent 2 days. They signed a number of agreements. The most interesting thing was they issued a joint statement at the end of the visit. They said these are the points we agreed. 17 out of 32 points of agreement were security related. This is something India never did with any of the Middle Eastern countries. They never wanted to talk about. Previously, we are tied down to Pakistan, Indo-Pakistan, cross-border terrorism and everything. But now you recognize ISIS is a major threat. It's a threat not only for me, but also for them. And therefore, you find a greater engagement between India and these countries on a variety of areas. And I think that is how you look at it. So initially, it was only economic cooperation, but now it is including in the military security area. But what it actually tells is this. During the Cold War, India was not an economic power. You depended on external powers for your basic necessities and things. Nobody took you seriously. You can say India is a third world non-alignment, but it never materialized into significant gains. The real change happened after economic liberalization. The classic example is a nuclear test. In 1998, immediately after the test, President Clinton said we are going to impose whole range of sanctions against India. We are going to stop, freeze and roll back India's nuclear capabilities. Good statement. 2 years later, he comes to Delhi without any of this condition being fulfilled. And 4 years later, President Bush comes and says, not only your nuclear test, let me give you civil nuclear cooperation without India having to give up the nuclear option. What does it tell you? Power recognizes power. It's very easy for me to get sympathy from you. Oh, I'm a poor Indian, my background is very limited, my parents have a problem, I have this illness. I can give million reasons to get your sympathy here. But there is, if I have to get your respect, I have to earn it. Respect is never given on a platter, you earn it. I think that is what India is trying to do. So that is very clearly visible in the Middle East. When you did not have a political leverage, you are competing with Pakistan, making political statements without anything substantial in return. But today, you are seen as the third largest economy in Asia, which basically means fourth in the world. And there are suggestions that India should topple Japan. At one level, I'm collaborating with Japan economically. At the same time, I want to overtake Japan economically. It's working in tandem. It's not your friend, but still I want to be one step ahead of you. I think the moment you accept, that is where the shift is taking place. So after 95, every major Arab ruler have come to India. They forgot India for the last 40 years. Suddenly everybody recognized, oh, India is an interesting thing. So previously, India was depending on this country for energy supplies. But now India is presenting itself as a stable market for your energy. Saudi Arabia is the largest producer, but you can't drink it. You have to export to somebody, right? So just like I need a stable supply, Saudi Arabia also needs a stable market for its supplies. I think that is how a new relationship is emerging. And if India's economic growth had to be sustained, it had to be tested only in the Middle East. The kind of relations India is going to have with the Middle Eastern countries in terms of investment from the region. People are talking about, for a variety of reasons, Gulf countries are willing to look eastwards for investment, sovereign wealth fund. For instance, Abu Dhabi is estimated to have somewhere around $700 billion sovereign wealth fund. They don't know what to do with it. So, but at the same time, they are not going to throw it down the drain. So it is up to India to develop, okay, these are the avenues you can do, and which will be beneficial for you, it will be helpful to me. So that is how a new kind of relationship is going to emerge. So while the Indian expatriates will be there, you are going to have a much more a sophisticated relationship, which is based on not only Indians doing the menial job in those countries, but is also looking at the countries of the region, looking India as a potential opportunities. I will stop at this point of time. If there is any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer that.